Jerusalem, the former SS Colonel Adolf Eichmann waits with his guards in a bulletproof glass dock. Judges enter the courtroom.
In May of 1960, Mossad agents captured a man who had been living for years under the name Ricardo Clement in a suburb of Buenos Aires. After weeks of undercover surveillance, they intercepted him between his house and the bus stop. Upon confirming his identity, he was secretly transferred to Israel aboard a commercial plane disguised as a diplomatic flight. This man was Adolf Eichmann, one of the main individuals responsible for the logistics of the Holocaust. For years, he had coordinated the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews to the extermination camps, signing documents and creating transportation schedules with bureaucratic precision. In Jerusalem, he was subjected to extensive interrogations. Throughout his statements, Eichmann tried to portray himself as a compliant official, detached from the Nazi brutalities, but his own words reveal much more. This is the interrogation of Adolf Eichmann, a direct testimony, without intermediaries.
The evidence is in 2 boxes.
April 11th, 1961.
The court, or what?
You recognize who I am. I am Colonel Hofstetter from the Israeli police.
Of course.
I have been informed that you are willing, in fact eager, to give us your version of the events regarding your role in the so-called Third Reich. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Captain Less will stay with you to take your statement. If you need documents, he will make a note of them, and we will do our best to obtain them. That's all.
Let's start with your curriculum vitae.
I was born on March 19th, 1906, in Solingen, in the Rhine region. My father was an accountant at the local electricity company. In 1913, he was transferred to Linz, on the banks of the Danube. Since then, I lived there with my parents and siblings. My mother passed away when I was 10 years old. My father, deeply religious, remarried a strict woman, also Protestant. I was the oldest of 5 siblings. I studied in elementary school and then at the Kaiser Franz Realschule. After the revolution, there were disturbances even in the classroom. We lived in the center at Bischofstrasse number 3. At the age of 15, due to my poor performance, my father took me out of school and sent me to work in his bituminous shale mine. I stayed there for about 3 months. Then, I became an apprentice at Electrotech. Radio was a novelty, and I focused on that field. Later, my father guided me towards direct sales. Thanks to a family recommendation, I joined Vacuum Oil Company. I was 22 years old when I presented myself at their headquarters in Vienna. After a brief training, I was assigned an exclusive district in Upper Austria. This is how my professional career began.
Did you live with your parents at that time?
Yes, although I only returned on weekends. My work area included part of Mühlviertel, a rural region, almost without electricity. I enjoyed that slow-paced life, the forests, the ruins. I worked there until 1933, when I was transferred to Salzburg. At first I was attracted to the alpine surroundings, but with the arrival of tourism, I lost interest. After Pentecost, I was dismissed. I was paid 5 months' salary. I returned to Linz. I thought of starting a small lubricants business, but something went wrong. While walking to see my first client in Efferding, I changed my mind. After all, I am a German citizen. I'll try my luck in Germany. I had the support of my parents, a German passport, and a letter of recommendation from the consul. Besides the economic aspect, there was also a personal background. At school, I sympathized with nationalist, monarchist, or socialist groups, though more out of friendship than conviction. Through a friend, I joined the German-Austrian Veterans Youth Association. We practiced shooting in Linz. Between 1928 and 31, that organization began to take on a more nationalist tone. I remember a rally of the National Socialist Party at the Marzenkeller. The Gauleiter Bolek spoke. At the end, Kaltenbrunner approached me. I knew him from before. Our parents were business partners. He said to me, "You are going to join us." And so I did. I joined the SS in early 1932. On Fridays, I traveled to Linz to guard the Brown House. I slept on a mattress and shared with the comrades. On Saturday mornings, I would return home and finish the reports. At that time, we got new uniforms: brown shirt, black jacket, wool pants, and beret. We crossed to Freilassing to train with the SS Auxiliary Unit. When the party was banned in Austria, I knew I had no future there. Without a job and with the party dissolved, I decided to leave permanently. Kaltenbrunner gave me some letters to take to Passau, where I was to meet Gauleiter Bolek. After waiting several hours, he received me. I explained my situation and asked for help to get into vacuum oil in Bavaria. He replied that before that, I had to learn how to march. So I agreed. I was sent to Kloster Lechfeld.
What kind of place was Lechfeld? A military barracks or a school? And what happened next when you were assigned to Dachau?
Lechfeld was a training center built by the former army during the Great War. There were many barracks, a nearby monastery, and even a brewery. We were trained by the Bavarian State Police. We were known as the Austrian Legion. Full units of the SA and an entire Sturmbahn of the SS composed of over 500 men lived there. We were divided into infantry and engineers. I was assigned to the assault section because I was physically strong. We were primarily trained in urban combat. I was quickly promoted to company first sergeant, responsible for keeping the shooting records due to my neat handwriting. In addition to military training, we marched for hours to prepare for the party congress. In October of 1933, I received orders to present myself in Passau before Sturmbannführer Pichel, head of the Reichsführer SS liaison team. Our mission was to patrol the Austro-Bavarian border, collaborating with the border police. Many fugitives crossed from Austria into Germany and had to be processed. If they were members of the SA or SS, they were sent to the Austrian Legion. Nazi propaganda was also smuggled from Bavaria into Austria. The task was monotonous, but I liked it because I traveled through the Bavarian forests, which resembled the Mühlviertel, a place I considered my second home. I never felt attached to Solingen, but I did consider Austria my homeland. In Passau, we had lunch at a butcher's shop that also sold hot sausages with potato salad. Pichel appointed me as his assistant. He would assign me small sums to cover lunches and basic items, and I was also responsible for writing reports for the headquarters in Munich. It was an idle, meaningless life, and I suspected that Pichel had personal interests there. He enjoyed the good life, was very courteous, and was popular among certain local ladies. Finally, after Christmas of 1934, the section was dissolved. I was sent to Dachau with the rank of Unterscharführer. The discipline there was strictly military. We were part of the Deutschland Regiment, composed solely of Austrians. Our facilities were outside the concentration camp, a concrete hangar that had previously served as an ammunition depot. We slept in triple bunks. The camp was guarded by Bavarian SS members with skull insignias. We wore the double S runic symbol with the number 1. Our commander was a former Prussian police major who had become an SS officer. The company captains were also former Prussian officers. They rode horses during the parades while we marched on foot. The training was equivalent to that of the Reichswehr, nothing like the shock tactics at Lechfeld. The discipline was strict. I stayed there until September of 1934. That's when I started hearing that the Reichsführer's SD was recruiting men with military experience. Many comrades, dissatisfied with the routine in Dachau, were talking about it. I didn't mind the physical rigor, but rather the crushing monotony. To make it clearer, in Lechfeld, once we were made to crawl over gravel and reeds as punishment. Several excused themselves with medical certificates. I, however, endured the punishment with my elbows raw. I didn't bandage them. In the afternoon, we returned to training and the scabs were ripped off. Even without skin, I kept going. That gained me some attention and led to my promotion. So it wasn't the harshness of Dachau that made me consider leaving, but the routine. When I learned that the SD needed men, I thought to myself, this is for me.
Yes, the Reichsführer SS was Heinrich Himmler, correct? What happened when you arrived in Berlin to join the SD?
Correct. Himmler was the Reichsführer SS. When I decided to join the SD, I did so because I believed that's where the real action was. I wanted to be where things were happening, so I asked for permission to go to Munich and apply. After completing a questionnaire, I returned to Dachau without receiving any news for weeks. Eventually, I was called. I was to report immediately to the Reichsführer SS Security Service. I received travel orders to Berlin and reported to Wilhelmstrasse 102. I was surprised not to find myself at Prince Albrecht Strasse, the headquarters of the Gestapo. The SD headquarters was located in the Hohenzollern Palace. The initial experience was disappointing. I had expected to see escort units in cars, as depicted in the illustrated magazines from Munich, but I had confused the SD with the Reich Security Service. I was assigned a bunk in the barracks and came under the command of Untersturmführer Peterson. I was sworn in and warned about the confidentiality of everything we did. I felt out of place. I had come from being outdoors, and now I had to walk carefully on waxed floors. My first task was to organize files on Freemasons, a subject I knew nothing about. Then I was transferred to the so-called Masonic Museum, under the command of Oberscharführer Richter, where I classified seals, medals, and objects seized from lodges. I was there for about 5 months. During a visit from Untersturmführer von Mildenstein, he asked me questions. I answered as best as I could, and he offered me a position in his newly created Jewish Affairs Department. I accepted without hesitation, eager to leave the stamps behind. I reported to his office, where he handed me The Jewish State by Theodor Herzl and asked me to write a summary for the SS, which was later published as an orientation brochure. That's how I began to specialize in Zionism, supported by Mildenstein. I worked with Wisliceny and Danaker when our office was formed. I handled Zionism, while they focused on other areas of Judaism. We received reports from meetings, seized literature, newspapers, and intelligence material. In 1937, we began writing monthly reports which, after passing through Wisliceny, were sent to Dr. Six, our superior. That's how it all began.
Do you remember when you were transferred to the new department? Who were your superiors in the Jewish section?
I was transferred to the SD in September 1934. Shortly afterward, Untersturmführer von Mildenstein offered me a position in a new department focused on Jewish affairs. I accepted immediately. I was tired of filing Masonic medallions and stamps. He was my first direct superior, Austrian like me, cultured and approachable. He gave me The Jewish State by Theodor Herzl to read. It left a strong impression on me. The political approach, the idealism, the idea of a national homeland. I immersed myself in the subject, wrote a summary as a guide for other SD members, and that text was even printed as an orientation pamphlet for the SS. In 1936, von Mildenstein was transferred to the Todd organization, and my new superior was a young, arrogant man with no experience. He didn't last long. He was drafted into the army just weeks later. Then came Dieter Wisliceny, who led the section with calmness and a somewhat academic air. Shortly afterward, Theodor Danaker joined us, taking charge of the assimilationist Jewish groups. I remained in charge of the Zionist area. Together, we formed the Jewish section of Office 112 of the SD.
In other words, you were a committed National Socialist, a loyal member of the SS, faithful to the oath you had taken. How do you then explain your claim that you never hated Jews, nor were anti-Semitic? Could you also describe what kind of feelings you truly had toward the Jews?
That is true, Captain. I was always loyal to the party, but personally, I never felt hatred toward the Jews. Had I been assigned to a camp like Dachau, not on the administrative side, but as a concentration camp guard, I might have had a crisis of conscience from the very beginning. But for years, I had no direct contact with any of that. I was in an administrative unit, with no involvement in custody or violence. And so I didn't question it. It simply wasn't part of my reality. In the early days in Austria, what concerned us was not the Jewish question, but bread, jobs, and ending servitude. I don't deny that anti-Semitism was present in the party, even in Mein Kampf. Although honestly, I never read it thoroughly nor felt the need to. I even remember meeting an SS Scharführer who was Jewish. One day he came to see me in Berlin and told me that he had fought in the early days and now didn't know what to do. I advised him to flee, to go to Switzerland or wherever he could, because he had no future there. I helped him cross the border using a method we had inherited from Section 6, which sent agents abroad. And he wasn't the only case. I helped my cousin leave. I even assisted a Jewish couple at the request of my uncle, who reminded me that it was thanks to him that I had gotten my job at Vacuum Oil Company, a company run by Jews like Popper, Weiss, Blum. They always treated me well. I could have denounced those people, of course, but it seemed overly meticulous to me, an unnecessary formality. I never hid those episodes. I never had hate in my heart.
Nevertheless, the truth is that your responsibility was not limited to personal decisions. From Vienna, you were in charge of an office whose task was clear. Wasn't part of your job to make Vienna free of Jews by the end of 1940? And in December of '39, Dr. Lowenherz visited you in Berlin and informed you that the Joint Distribution Committee would only continue sending foreign currency if the deportations to Poland ceased. You authorized him to communicate that they would be suspended as long as sufficient funding was guaranteed until October of 1940. Is that correct?
Yes, Captain, that's correct. I communicated those conditions to Lowenherz directly in Berlin. By then, I was no longer dependent on Vienna or Prague. Everything I did was coordinated with Section 4 of the Gestapo. I remember submitting that request in writing, possibly even addressed to Heydrich through the relevant section chief. The response was clear: no more deportations. Shortly after, Miller officially assigned me the leadership of Bureau 4B4. I suppose he considered it unnecessary to maintain so much personnel in an emigration office that was barely functioning, and he wanted to reduce the staff. Our team moved to Kurfürstenstrasse, but we continued working with the same corps, me in charge, Rolf Günther as my right hand. With emigration practically paralyzed due to the war, I began looking for new solutions. That's when the Madagascar plan emerged. I remembered the writings of Adolf Böhm and how Theodor Herzl had once considered that option. We investigated thoroughly. I reached out to the Ministry of the Interior, the Bernhard Nocht Institute for Tropical Medicine, and gathered all possible information. My idea was to establish an autonomous Jewish region on the island as a way to provide an escape valve in an increasingly unsustainable situation. What I had observed in Theresienstadt convinced me that ghettos were not viable. Even the Gauleiters themselves were pushing to get rid of the Jews in their regions. But as always in our administration, each ministry raised objections. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs argued that Madagascar was not German territory, and several others obstructed the project. When we finally managed to reach a common proposal, it was too late. The military situation in France became critical, communications were interrupted, and the plan fell apart. It was the year 1940. That's when Miller started sending me to inspect ghettos in the east. Litzmannstadt, Warsaw. Officially, my office was still dealing with Jewish affairs, although the term final solution was already being used. But at that time, that term did not imply physical extermination. I myself had used it in the context of the Madagascar plan. Everything changed when Heydrich called me after the war with the Soviet Union began. He said, "The Führer has ordered the physical extermination of the Jews." He said it slowly, as if waiting to see how I would react. I didn't know what to say. Then he ordered me to visit Globoknik in Lublin. There, they showed me wooden barracks connected to Russian engines that injected gas inside. I was frozen in place. Later, I visited Kulm. I saw how they forced the Jews to undress, loaded them onto hermetically sealed trucks, and then unloaded their bodies into mass graves. A civilian was pulling out teeth with pliers. I vomited. I couldn't take it anymore. I told everything to Miller. I only said, "It's hell." He didn't respond. He never responded. Then came more orders. Minsk, Treblinka, Auschwitz, Lemberg. In Minsk, I still saw shootings in the pit. In Lemberg, blood spurted from the ground like a geyser. In Auschwitz, Höss showed me the facility. They used Zyklon B, little tablets that looked like coasters. I didn't see how they used them, but I did see a huge pit where bodies were burning. In Treblinka, they camouflaged the entrance as if it were a station. I saw the Jews, naked, crossing the bridge into the interior. I didn't want to look anymore. I never gave an order for murder. I only received instructions to evacuate. I never saw Zyklon B in action. I only heard its description. Höss said that even Himmler had felt sick witnessing it. Miller just wanted reports. I begged him to send me to the front, that I wasn't suited for this. He never listened. I was at the Wannsee Conference because I handled the emigration data. I wrote the invitations and sat at the back with the stenographer. Heydrich talked about evacuations to the east as a replacement for emigration, but by then, the murders had already begun. Wannsee was just to coordinate things better. Many believe that this means I had power. It wasn't like that. I didn't decide anything. I never saw a written order for extermination. I only received a verbal instruction from Heydrich. And from that moment on, every trip, every report, became another burden. There was never any respite.
In the Wannsee documentation, there is mention of practical experience. What exactly did Heydrich mean by that expression? Was it perhaps the experience accumulated in the massacres that had already begun in the East?
Yes, Captain. That meeting on January 20th, 1942, was convened to better coordinate what was already happening. The action teams had been operating for some time, and the killings of Jews were already underway in the occupied territories. That was the practical experience referred to. Heydrich stated that the Jews would be used as labor in large work columns, separated by sex, and that many of them would die from natural attrition. This expression, in administrative language, meant exhaustion, disease, and hunger. He added that the survivors, considered a natural elite, should be treated accordingly, that is, executed directly. There is no other possible interpretation. Heydrich said everything with euphemisms, but the intention was unequivocal. Even the State Secretary Buehler, on behalf of the general government, urged that the final solution begin as soon as possible in his territory. He argued that more than 2.5 million Jews lived in that area, the majority unable to work, and that they posed a health and economic risk. In other words, he was requesting their mass extermination. After the conference, Heydrich ordered me to draft an official letter for Globoknik. It authorized him to subject another 150,000 Jews to the process. In reality, those people had already been executed. The letter had retroactive effect because Globoknik insisted on having written authorization.
Did you also supervise the statistical reports on the Jews who were deported? And the data you provided to the statistician Korher included figures on exterminations?
Yes, Captain. After the conference, our work focused on preparing regular reports on the evacuations. Every time a transport left, we received the data. Those were the only numbers we knew. Shipments, not deaths. Gunther, my assistant, even drew a graph on the wall of his office. Every visitor could see it, a thick line showing the progression. I don't remember the final number, but it did not include the deceased. When Himmler wanted to present a summary to the Führer, he sent a statistician, Richard Korher. He spent several days in my office. I provided him with all the shipment figures, but I had no information about executions. He wrote his report and sent it through Bormann. The response was clear. The Führer has taken note. Destroy the document. It was even demanded to replace terms like liquidation or special treatment. The report was kept as useful material for camouflage purposes. Only then did I understand that even the Führer should not be openly shown what was happening.
Did you ever have a meeting with the Jewish leaders of Berlin, Vienna, and Prague to communicate high-level decisions?
Yes, Captain. I clearly remember that meeting. It was in Berlin, shortly after a propaganda exhibition titled The Red Paradise. There was sabotage linked to the event, and by order of Müller, several representatives of the Jewish communities were summoned. Among them were Dr. Löwenherz from Vienna, Mermelstein from Prague, and Epstein from Berlin. In total, there were about 6 or 8 officials. They were informed that, in retaliation for the sabotage, certain Jews would be executed. There was no discussion. They were simply informed, and the order was carried out. As for the activities of the central offices, we received direct instructions from the head of recruitment for the Waffen-SS, Gruppenführer Berger. It was suggested to allow the emigration of some elderly Jews in exchange for large sums in foreign currency, meant to finance the family allowances of the Hungarian volunteers enrolled in the SS. My department could not decide on its own. We had to consult the higher authorities. But in essence, yes, the rescue of some Jews was authorized for 100,000 Swiss francs each. Not all of them were so fortunate. 2 Jews from Vienna, Professor Fleischmann and Master Coleman, tried to emigrate to Afghanistan after being contacted to teach there. But when their letter ended up in the hands of the German embassy in Kabul, a bureaucratic chain was set in motion that ended with my signature on a letter dated February 28, 1941. There I wrote with my own hand that they would be deported to the general government. The case was resolved. That's how everything worked. Later on, I received a recommendation for promotion to Obersturmbannführer, signed by SS Brigadeführer Streckenbach. My outstanding contribution to the de-Judization of Ostmark was praised, highlighting the assets obtained for the Reich and my necessary toughness in fulfilling my duty. This is how things were said in the SS. Toughness was a slogan, just as resistance would later be. But yes, I did what was asked of me. I do not deny it. I obeyed with zeal. That was expected of me. And my promotion was a logical consequence. Money and property are also mentioned. The emigration funds came from the belongings of the Jews, part of what they left behind and what was confiscated from them. That was how the system was designed. And yes, I was the one who signed, although many times it was a text written by someone else. Did I think extermination was necessary for the survival of the German people? Captain, at that time we questioned nothing. If they had told me that my own father was a traitor, I would have executed him. That was the strength of the sense of duty. We never interpreted an order. We just obeyed. I know it seems incomprehensible now, but at that time we lived it as something natural. Obeying was our only path. If someone could not accept an order, they had only one way out: to commit suicide. And we all knew that. I myself wanted to go to the front like so many of my men, but from the Gestapo, such exits were not granted. They needed us there. When I am asked about figures, I cite what we remember. In 1945, I spoke in front of several subordinates. I mentioned 5 million. With satisfaction? Absolutely not. What I felt was a moral shock. Everything had collapsed. The Reich was lost. And it had all been in vain. That was my reflection. But turning that into cynicism is theater. That phrase attributed to me, that I would jump into the grave laughing, I never said it. My men would have taken me for a madman. They knew it wasn't me giving the orders to kill. We were just the office of delivery. That's how we lived it.
But in 1942, you were already head of the department. Wasn't your office also responsible for the deportations of the Roma?
Yes, Captain. That's correct. I was in charge of the office, but decisions like the one regarding liturgy were not in our hands. Those were decided much higher up. The same was true with the Roma. We just received the order. I don't remember if all of them were deported or if all ended up in extermination camps. The ones from the west, I remember more clearly, were taken to a ghetto in Litzmannstadt. That was early on, before the war with France. Then indeed many ended up in Auschwitz. But as for directives, there were no specific ones. The Reichsführer personally decided. In other cases, different departments had to be consulted, but with the Roma, no one cared about nationalities or details. There were no studies on them, no organized files. We didn't have individual records. Documents only arrived much later, when there were almost none left. There was talk of large numbers in the East, in Poland, Hungary, Romania, but I cannot confirm that. In the Reich, I don't think there were more than 5,000 or 6,000. It wasn't an organized population like the Jews. Everything was improvised. I remember that at the beginning, I heard about the use of gas. It was my assistant, Gunther, who mentioned it. I was surprised, it shocked me. And of course, I asked him how he could have been involved in something like that. But I don't remember ever saying anything about justifying myself to Müller. Maybe he was just following orders just like me. In my office, we didn't give any orders to acquire gas. And yet, everyone involved in the extermination camps points to me. That's the absurdity of it. Officially, we had nothing to do with it. And unofficially, neither. But of course I knew. I don't deny it. I knew they were using gas. Everyone knew.
Even so, your name appears directly in an official document from the Ministry for the Eastern Territories, where it states that you approved the sending of technicians to install gas chambers in Riga. What do you have to say about that?
That document mentions a letter from Brack, from the Führer's office, where it discusses sending a chemist, Dr. Kallmeyer, to Riga to assist with the construction of gas systems. And yes, it's true that my name appears giving consent, but that doesn't mean I gave the order or coordinated that operation. I was simply consulted as a specialist in the Office of Jewish Affairs, and I merely conveyed the approval that had been passed down from above. The operation was managed by the Ministry of the East and Brack's office. We neither had the competence nor the capacity to manufacture gas systems. I don't know who initiated that process, whether it was Wetzel from the Ministry of the East or someone else. I also don't believe my assistant Günther acted on his own when sending chemicals. I never personally authorized the purchase of prussic acid. The relationship with Globoknik existed, of course, because I was the one who visited him by direct order. I saw the facilities, wrote the report, and sent it to Müller, but to say that my office was in charge of the gas supply, that is false. We never managed that material. Officially, we had nothing to do with it. Unofficially, neither. I knew, of course, but I didn't direct it. I knew that mass murders with gas existed, yes, I knew, but that doesn't make it the direct responsibility of my department.
Do you remember if Kastner proposed to guarantee the lives of 100,000 Hungarian Jews, including children, the elderly, and the sick, in exchange for 5 million Swiss francs in jewels, currency, and pengos? And wasn't it also Becker who coordinated with you the departure of certain groups to Palestine as part of that deal?
It is possible that Kastner made me that proposal. I do not deny it because I am not sure, but I also cannot confirm it with certainty. If he really made that offer, it must have been during one of our many conversations in Budapest. What I do remember with absolute clarity is that my orders were different. I had precise instructions to manage an exchange in which, in exchange for 1 million Jews, the Reich would receive 10,000 trucks. That was the official directive I was entrusted with, and all other initiatives, even if they existed, were subordinated to that general framework. I was not authorized to negotiate outside of those parameters, nor did I have the authority to accept offers of a different nature without consulting my superiors. As for Becker, yes, he was in charge of the financial aspect of those operations. He had a specific mission directly assigned by the Reichsführer SS, and in that context he held frequent meetings with Kastner. In fact, on several occasions the three of us met, Becker, Kastner, and I. However, I must point out that my participation in those meetings was primarily operational. Becker was the one who handled all the financial aspects, organized the payments, decided the logistics, and negotiated the terms directly with Kastner. He was the one who proposed which groups could leave, under what conditions, and what economic compensations would be provided in return. It was mostly about young Jews from the eastern regions of Hungary. The plan was to secretly take them out of the country, crossing the border into Romania, without the Hungarian government knowing. I had no involvement in the selection of individuals or the management of the money. I did not handle funds, did not authorize payments, and did not participate in the details of the deal. My role was limited solely to ensuring that the German police did not interfere in those operations. If Becker required cover to facilitate a transfer, I would give the necessary instructions to my team to ensure there was no interference. But nothing more. I did not authorize departures on my own, nor did I negotiate any exchanges directly. I also remember that in one of those meetings, Kastner showed up with a suitcase full of foreign currency. I don't know if he intended to hand it over at that moment, or if it was part of the first payment of a larger operation. But the truth is, that situation ended up attracting the attention of the Hungarian secret services, especially because of the presence of the money. From then on, working with the Hungarian police became extremely complicated. There was distrust, growing tensions, and a hostile environment that made any operation difficult. As for the accusations of threats, I must firmly reject one in particular that has been frequently mentioned, the supposed phrase, the Auschwitz mill. I never used that phrase, never. In fact, I first heard it much later, after the war, when a movie with that title was released. To say that I used those words as a threat is simply false, a fabrication. In my conversations with Jewish representatives or with any other interlocutors, I never resorted to that kind of language. It was not part of my way of acting.
But we have seen in these documents that the Hungarian authorities offered resistance, with the possible exception of Undersecretary Endre. That is why you and your group were there, to exert enough pressure. And isn't it true that according to the documents, the plan was to gather 1 million Jews in 4 months and deport them? That is, your operation was carried out under extreme pressure to complete it as quickly as possible.
Captain, the resistance in Hungary did not come from mere officials. It was Horthy, the regent, along with his closest circles who opposed our actions. And breaking that resistance was not something that a small team from the security police or the SD like ours could achieve. That task was in the hands of the highest echelons of the Reich, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Berlin, the Reichsführer SS himself, the head of the German police. They were the ones responsible for breaking down that political wall, not Eichmann's special team. Our role had a much more limited scope, and although we were present on the ground, we were not the ones determining Hungary's political course. As for the second issue, yes, it is true. From the beginning, the order was clear: evacuate as quickly as possible. I myself received direct instructions in this regard, from east to west, and that urgency clearly showed that the German leadership had a fairly precise understanding of how the war was evolving. Speed was essential, but Captain, with the few men I had at my disposal, it was not possible to accelerate the pace beyond what was already being done. The only instance that could really make a difference in speed was the Hungarian Ministry of the Interior. If, for example, the Hungarian gendarmerie had decided to sabotage our actions, and I will say this bluntly, we wouldn't have been able to do anything. Absolutely nothing. That operational dependency was total. Our team was small. Key decisions were in other hands, and much of the execution was in the hands of local authorities.
But what about the second march mentioned in these documents? In this telegram from Wiesenmeyer, dated November 13, 1944, it is reported that 30,000 Jews were already en route to Reich territory. What do you have to say about that?
Captain, first of all, regarding that supposed second march, what I can say is the following. When numbers like 50,000 are mentioned, and then another march with another 50,000 is added, it is clearly an exaggeration. There is a tendency to inflate numbers when it suits the situation, and here, that has clearly been done. I do not deny that such figures were mentioned in the reports. In fact, it is possible that at some point it was written that 30,000 were on the move. But personally, I only clearly remember the march of 10,000. And that was, to the best of my recollection, the only one carried out under the conditions that were communicated to me from above. As for the content of that telegram from Wiesenmeyer, yes, I am familiar with it. He was reporting to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Berlin about the state of the situation. It said, for example, that in the lower Danube area, only extremely fit men could be used, preferably under the age of 40, which aligns with the directive to use the strongest for tasks like building fortifications or anti-tank ditches. It also mentions diplomatic efforts with the Swiss and Swedish embassies, but I have no information on that. I did not participate in those conversations. What I do remember is that at that point it was estimated that there were about 80,000 Jews remaining in the general ghetto of Budapest, and about 16,000 in the special ghetto, most of them holders of safe conducts. Now, whether it is said that 30,000 Jews were on the move at that time, it may be. I won't argue that. It's possible that number was reached if you add up the different stages of the evacuation. But I insist again, regarding my direct involvement, my team only carried out one specific operation, and that was the march of 10,000. Everything else was managed, supervised, or at least authorized by other organizations. At no point was I instructed to organize multiple marches of that size, let alone on my own initiative. And of course, I never deviated from the orders I received. That's why that figure of 50,000, even 30,000, always seemed inflated to me from the start.
His former collaborator Dieter Wisliceny was interrogated at the time and was asked, "When did you last see Eichmann?" His response was, "I last saw him in February 1945 in Berlin. He said that if Germany lost the war, he would commit suicide. I have also read his 22-page report written in Bratislava on November 18, 1946. Would you like to make any comments?
Captain, that statement from Wisliceny surprised me as much as it outraged me. I never had personal issues with him, except perhaps his frustration for not having been promoted, which wasn't up to me, but rather due to an internal regulation that required one to be married. Even so, there were never any conflicts. That's why I find it difficult to understand why, in his report, he makes so many false statements about me and my duties. I began to think that he did it out of resentment. Perhaps, feeling alone and abandoned, he thought his former superiors had disappeared and wanted to take revenge, exaggerating or fabricating details to save himself. But that's not fair. I didn't disappear as he suggests. I was taken prisoner by the Americans and remained in their custody until January 1946. I didn't hide or prepare any escape. I could have done so, yes, but I rejected that idea. He, on the other hand, found himself before a tribunal, with all the spotlight on him, without any of his superiors being there to share the burden. That situation may have influenced his motivations. As you know, he ended up being handed over to the Czechoslovakians, tried for his activities in Slovakia, and eventually executed. Perhaps that's why he tried to distance himself from the system he had served, presenting himself as someone who had always opposed it, as many do when everything has collapsed. And about that report you're showing me, the one from Bratislava, it's full of unsupported claims. He even paints a picture of me as if I were the supreme commissioner of the fate of all the Jews in Europe, with full powers. But that wasn't the case. I was dependent on the head of Section 4, Miller, and all my instructions came from above. I never acted on my own nor decided policies. Wisliceny rewrites history to redeem himself, mixing true facts with inventions, trying to show that he was always opposed to the decisions he carried out. I, on the other hand, have never said such a thing. I have always acknowledged that I followed the orders given to me, and I'm not now hiding behind childish excuses. That report is, at its core, a mixture of truth, opinion, and opportunism.
And these agreements on deportations, like the one signed in Sofia, were they also replicated in other countries? Were you or your office the ones who set those directives?
That's correct, Captain. That was the standard in almost all cases. My people, advisors on Jewish affairs like Dachau or Wisliceny, operated with the authorization of the highest authorities, whether military or civilian. For example, in Bulgaria, Dachau would not have been able to sign any agreement without the consent of the German minister in that country. It's clear that before any measure was formalized, the German minister would have had to discuss it with the local cabinet. This same pattern was repeated in France, Pressburg, Romania. The machinery operated according to a pre-established structure. But no, I did not issue general directives for those agreements. In many cases, the agreements were drafted directly between local representatives and our delegations. This agreement in Bulgaria may have been different because there a commissioner for Jewish affairs had been specifically appointed. Who proposed him? I don't know, but usually everything was handled through correspondence between the German agencies and the national authorities.
But if the objective was to obtain labor, how do you explain that in the Bulgarian agreement it was accepted to deport Jews without distinction of age or sex? Doesn't that contradict the supposed interest of the Reich?
That clause is difficult for me to understand. As you've said, it clearly states, Jews without distinction of age or sex. That means children, the elderly, women. Of course, I can't say who gave that order, because if we analyze the documents, it's clear that the Reich was primarily interested in obtaining capable workers, not loading trains with people who couldn't be employed for anything. That condition wasn't rational from an economic standpoint. It may have been imposed by the Bulgarian Commissioner for Jewish Affairs, perhaps as a way to eliminate the entire community without exceptions, but I can't say that for certain. In any case, I must point out something. Within our structure, there were office chiefs who acted recklessly, even with a certain superficiality. They gave orders without considering the consequences, and then the problems arose. In my case, it was the opposite. I required that every step be justified in writing. You couldn't lift a finger without documented backing. This is something even my subordinates recognize, although they may not have appreciated it at the time. But it was the only way to maintain order amidst the chaos. If that agreement included such radical clauses, it certainly wasn't drafted under my directives or with my direct involvement.
In that context, allow me to ask you, when parents and children over the age of 14 were deported to Auschwitz, what happened to the younger children? Who took care of them?
Captain, I have repeated this many times. Once the trains arrived at their destination and the passengers disembarked, my responsibility ended. That part of the procedure was not under my jurisdiction. I was not in charge of organizing what happened inside the camps. Therefore, I cannot answer exactly what happened with children under 14 or with babies. I know the same as anyone else has read after the war. Now, if you mention the notes from Commander Höss of Auschwitz, I must say that those statements, like the supposed visit of the Reichsfuhrer inspecting the extermination process and the later arrival of Blobel with specific instructions, do not reflect any direct order from me. Blobel did not report to me, nor did I to him. He was never under my command. The only thing I know is that Miller assigned him accommodation in our offices in Berlin due to space issues, but his task was different. He was responsible for eliminating traces of executions, opening mass graves, incinerating remains, and destroying evidence. That was what was known as the 100 to 105 team. But that unit was not structurally part of my office. I never had operational control over Blobel, and our personal relations were even tense. He was a rough man, drank too much, and on one occasion, under the influence of alcohol, he treated my staff as if he were in his own barracks. We argued, and we even challenged each other to a duel. Miller had to intervene to prevent the situation from escalating. Later, I learned that he had been executed for his involvement in executions in the East, but he never spoke to me about that while I knew him.
And didn't it seem to you that by ordering the erasure of all traces of the executions, Germany was acknowledging that the war was lost?
That suspicion began to linger in my mind long before. Already in 1941, I made comments that earned me reprimands from Miller. I told my men that if we kept going like this, we would lose the war. I told Wisliceny more than once that I didn't believe in the 1,000-year Reich. I said, when Hitler dies, all of this will come crashing down, because the same thing happened with Alexander the Great's empire. After his death, it collapsed. History is full of examples. In private conversations with Günther, I also expressed my doubts about victory. Although I must confess that, for a time, I believed in the so-called miracle weapons. When I first heard about rockets and other technological developments, I thought maybe we could still win. But that hope faded. Then, many started looking for a survival formula. Becker, Wisliceny, Krumi. They began to adopt a new stance, preparing for what would come if we lost. That shift partly explains why, after 1945, so many former colleagues offered such similar testimonies. Some even resorted to absurd defamations, trying to distance themselves from me. Propaganda had already turned me into a central figure of the repressive apparatus, as if I were the only one responsible for everything. And that made it easier for others to use me as a shield, to clear their own names. But, as I told you before, I never intended to deny my role or hide behind false amnesias. I have accepted what I did, with all that it entails.
In the last lines of your testimony, you make a personal statement. Do you wish to keep it?
Yes, word for word. I have said everything I remember. There may be more, buried in my memory, and I am willing to share it. I will no longer hide. I know I will be condemned, even though I never killed with my own hands. But I accept the responsibility. I do not ask for mercy. I just want to write a book, one that serves as a warning. And then, if hanging in public serves as a lesson, so be it. I am ready.
After more than 270 hours of interrogation, Adolf Eichmann recorded his time in the Third Reich not in carefully crafted memoirs like Rudolf Höss or Hans Frank, but in the raw and direct pages of these sessions. An extensive confession, though carefully calculated. For nearly a year, Captain Avner Less, an Israeli officer born in Berlin, confronted him in his own language. With precision without theatrics, he unraveled the evasions of the bureaucrat of extermination. Over 3,000 pages were recorded word by word. Eichmann corrected some, signed each one. He could not deny what was written there. The trial began on April 11, 1961, in Jerusalem. For 7 months, the world listened to testimonies, documents, and a defense based on blind obedience. But the extent of his actions was impossible to evade. On December 1st, Eichmann was sentenced to death. On May 31, 1962, he was hanged. His body was cremated. His ashes were scattered at sea, without a grave, without remains, without physical memory. This was the story of the interrogation of Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat of death confronted with his truth.